Now in this lesson, let's finally start talking about actually writing some of our ideas on the piano. And to start with, we're going to first start writing motifs. What is a motif? A motif can be many things, but really it's any short musical idea that is associated with a person, thing, place, idea, or even narrative subtext. A lot of times we kind of think first of melodic motifs, but really motifs can be really any aspect of a musical score. So to demonstrate, we do know of a lot of melodic motifs. For example, we might have, you might know this motif from Superman. You might recognize that. It's short, identifiable, it's recognizable. That's what we might call a melodic motif. But there are other things that we can make into motifs as well that we can associate with those people, places, things, narrative subtext. It can be a chordal movement or a chordal progression, something like that movement of a tritone there, that could be its own motif. A rhythm could be a motif, something like so you can place that rhythm on really any note, but it still retains that same rhythm, so it kind of becomes its own motif. You can make a textural motif, and that's more with orchestration, but if you have something like this, you can repeat that with any notes, any key. That texture there is kind of its own thing. We can, again, associate that with anything that we want to in a film. And there are other things, really any aspect of music that we can make into a motif. We can make a time signature its own motif. I do know of several film scores where the use of a 3/4 time signature, that's kind of means its own thing. It can be compound versus simple meter. It can be, again, any aspect of music, timbre, texture, interval classes, if you're into that. It could be anything you want that can be associated with anything. Now, as you might be picking up on, motifs are very powerful, and they're very powerful because they're so recognizable and they're so identifiable, and people, even subconsciously, I think, can latch onto a motif, and especially when it's associated with something. This goes back to Wagner and the late romantics like him, but when it's associated with something and when the motif itself is very powerful and associated with something that's very powerful and very compelling, then all of a sudden you're starting to craft this really, really intricate, really emotionally powerful score. But now this all begs the question, what does make a motif identifiable? What makes a motif recognizable? I kind of have a list of things here that we can talk about in relation to this. The first thing I would say is simplicity. Many, especially melodic motifs, are very simple in nature. They don't go across a huge range of the keyboard. They don't use super complex rhythms. They can, if you really want that, but they're often just very simple, very to the point, I think is another good word for that. Another thing, number two, would be a striking identity of some sort. We're going to talk a little bit about this in a few moments, but a good motif often has its own identity, if you will. And an identity has its own DNA elements that make it up. Number three, I would say, is repeatability. And part of the reason that motifs are, again, so compelling and powerful is because they are so short, and often short, they are very repeatable. You can repeat them throughout an entire score, and so that when people go home and they remember the movie or they remember the show, and they might think about the music, oh yeah, I remember that. They might not call it a motif, but they might just remember that little bit of musical information that really stuck with them. Number four is motifs are often easily modified. Because they're simple, because they're short, I think it's really easy to work with them. You can expand the interval range, you can put it in a different part of the piano, you can just do all sorts of things with them. Another word for this might be malleable. And number five, it's kind of related to number three that we talked about, but I think maybe this is the most powerful thing, is that motifs are often the DNA of larger melodies and larger structures. Often these short motifs make up part of a longer theme or melody, or they make up part of a longer piece or cue in a movie, or they make up just a whole soundtrack from a show or a movie. And really, whatever makes up our motif, whatever the DNA elements of our motif, that is what makes its identity. So let's just dive into that a little bit here, and let's just look at what gives a motif its identity. Let's look at this motif right here. It's this. And with that motif, let's just talk about what the DNA elements are. And the DNA elements of this are really just two things. One is the rhythm. So that's a pretty recognizable, identifiable rhythm. And the second part, the second DNA element of this motif is the tritone. That interval right there. And so now when you put those two DNA elements together, it's... So now you combine those two, you fuse those two DNA elements together, now you have a recognizable, short, identifiable motif. And I think when you look at motifs really granularly like this, I think it also gives us an opportunity to look at what these different DNA elements mean emotionally as well. So if you look at this rhythm, you might associate that with maybe regality, or it's a march type of thing. But then when you throw in the tritone with it, now all of a sudden that tritone, that kind of represents instability. It's very not tonal. It's very angry almost. And so when you look at DNA elements in a motif like this, when you look at them very granularly like that, like I said, I think it's really important to consider how, not only how they sound, but how they feel emotionally to you as well. Because for example, if we were to change this motif a little bit, if we make it a perfect fourth instead, now all of a sudden it has quite a bit different sound, right? Now it feels a lot more stable. That rhythm is still the same. So it still has that march-like feel to it, but now it feels a little bit more grounded, I would say. But now what if we compare this to a perfect fifth instead? Now that feels a little bit grander, maybe a little bit more heroic. And a lot of composers, a lot of film composers use this kind of exploitation of the really intricate nuances between different intervals, different DNA elements to really make up what it is they're trying to associate. So with character themes, they use things like this a lot. Just for example, you might know a lot of John Williams' music. His music does this a lot. For example, for Indiana Jones, the perfect fourth is a really important part of that theme. So using that perfect fourth, it might feel a little more grounded, a little bit more human, as opposed to if it was an open fifth, a little bit larger of an interval. Which that doesn't sound right, but that open fifth might imply something a little bit grander, a little bit, like I said, a little bit more heroic. And John Williams does use the open fifth for bigger stories. Star Wars, for example. Really, these DNA elements can mean a whole lot if you sit down and think about them granularly, and think about them as how they sound and how they feel emotionally as well.